Well, thank you. It is really, really wonderful to be with you. This is, I must confess, my first visit to Dallas. And so I took full advantage. Today I spent the morning at the Art Museum, along with, I think, half of the city's elementary and middle school students. And one of whom was Eric's, he told me, his son was there. And then I paid my respects to John F. Kennedy in the afternoon. And so it is a real honor to be with you. So when Eric invited me to speak, I thought that it might be interesting to share with you the work of my PhD supervisor. Eric has said that I had the privilege and honor of being his Doctor of Ministry supervisor. I started my PhD at Durham University in England, studying with the Reverend Canon Professor David Brown, who was both a canon at Durham Cathedral, one of the senior clergy at the cathedral, and a professor at Durham University. Halfway through my PhD, he moved to St. Andrews in Scotland, and so I did also, and unexpectedly, for me, exactly, it was a real trial, but unexpectedly I ended up getting my PhD from St. Andrews rather than Durham, and so I moved to Swanee from St. Andrews. And David is somebody who is very well known in the UK, but whose reputation just hasn't quite crossed the Atlantic the way some other British theologians like Rowan Williams or Sarah Coakley, who are as well known here in theological circles as they are in Great Britain. David is someone who's still more well known in the UK. But I think he offers us a very helpful way to think about the sacraments, specifically to think of everything in sacramental terms. And in particular, he looks at the arts and human culture as ways in which God speaks to us sacramentally. So I do have a handout, and I'll refer to it at various points. And we'll also look at a number of slides and hear a couple of songs. So I know that this is an Episcopal church, so I assume that you are all familiar with the classic, famous definition of a sacrament: an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Many of you would have memorized that as part of your confirmation however many years ago. So what I've done here, the first thing on your handout, is these questions and answers from the current catechism. So the prayer book defines a sacrament as an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. And that actually goes back at least to St. Augustine in the 4th century. But then grace itself is defined as God's favor towards us, unearned and undeserved. Adding, by grace God forgives our sins, enlightens our minds, stirs our hearts, and strengthens our wills. And it further goes on to discuss what it calls the two great sacraments of the gospel, namely baptism and Eucharist, as well as the 5 other sacramental rites of confirmation, ordination, matrimony, reconciliation, and unction. And depending on whether you're on the low church evangelical side of Anglicanism, you'll say there are 2 sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. And if you're on the high church Anglo-Catholic side of Anglicanism, you'll say, no, there are 7 sacraments. And so that's one of the main debates that people often have about the sacraments. How many of them are there? But what's interesting is that in answer to the question, is God's activity limited to these rites, however many there are, 2 or 7, the Catechism's answer is God does not limit himself to these rites. They are patterns of countless ways by which God uses material things to reach out to us. God does not limit himself to these rites. They are patterns of countless ways by which God uses material things to reach out to us. So God does not limit God's self to the sacraments of the church, but we often do. And we often, as Christians, tend to think that the only things we should think of sacramentally are these official, very churchy things. And so what David Brown offers us is actually a much, much broader way to think about sacramental grace, one in which all of life may be understood in sacramental terms and not just what we do at church. So let me start with an essay that he published in a book with a title I really like, The Gestures of God, Explorations in Sacramentality. And his essay in this book is called Reconceiving the Sacramental. And on your handout, I've given you the first paragraph. This is how he opens this essay. He says, in talking of the need to reconceive the sacramental, I want to stake out my claim that the Church and its theologians have made a very serious error in withdrawing from theological engagement with large areas of human experience that were once the Church's concern. Topics like body and food, music and dance, landscape art and town planning, architecture and gardening were all once integral to a religious conception of the world. Whereas if they are discussed in theological context at all these days, the tendency is to treat them as merely illustrative of questions more appropriately raised elsewhere, rather than raising issues and challenges in their own right. The result is that both in its practice and in its theology, Christianity has become a very inward-looking religion, with its perceived external relevance almost wholly confined to ethics and politics. Now, basically everything you need to know about David Brown's sacramental theology is found in that paragraph. Brown claims that for some reason, Christian theologians have tragically lost interest in, and by the way, he's talking about people like me, just to be clear, I am a theologian. I teach theology at Sewanee, as Eric said, and so I guess if I could just speak somewhat autobiographically, a little parenthesis here. I went to study with David Brown because he's also well known for work in more conventional theology. He's written a book on the Trinity. He writes about what we call Christology, the doctrine of Christ. He writes about the atonement. He writes about conventional theological topics. And I went to work with him on an Anglican theologian named Austin Farrer of the earlier generation. But once I started working with David, I realized that his own constructive theological work had gotten very expansive, and he really challenged me to rethink what I thought theology was about. And so what I'm sharing with you here are things that I've learned from him that I'm trying to take on board as a professor of theology at an Episcopal seminary. So what he says here is that Christian theologians have tragically lost interest in, and thus withdrawn from thinking about, the primary areas of human experience. That is, things that most people are actually concerned about in their daily lives outside of church. And Brown suggests that we should return to those areas of human experience and ask if we can find God's grace at work within them on our behalf. That is, he suggests that we should think about things like the body and food and music and dance and landscape art and town planning and architecture and gardening and athletics and literature as sacramental, as outward and visible and audible and touchable signs of divine grace, as God's favor towards us. And in the rest of this essay, he develops this argument under three headings, but I'll just focus on two. In regard to what he calls a more comprehensive notion of sacrament, far from getting into those familiar debates that I mentioned earlier between Catholics and Protestants about whether the number of sacraments is 2 or 7, Brown wants us to discover a vision of the world in which a vast number of objects and practices can be described legitimately as sacramental. And in regard to the heading of specific applications, in this essay, Brown looks very briefly at athletics and architecture. But what I want to now do is shift from this essay and take us through three connected books that he's written on seeing the sacraments in human culture. And by the way, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me in the back row? Do I need to speak up louder? I know I'm microphoned, but okay. But I wanted to, and by the way, if you don't have a handout, I noticed a couple of people have come in. If you don't have a handout, there are some on the back table there, and I think Dr. Lyles can give you a handout if you need one. Well, you earned your doctorate with me, so I'm going to call you Dr. Lyles. Eric. So what Brown does is he's written three connected books in which he explores this idea. And the first one is called God and Enchantment of Place, Reclaiming Human Experience. And it deals mainly with art and architecture. And the first extended example that Brown deals with here may seem rather arcane and technical, but it's actually quite interesting. So right now, particularly in Episcopal circles, I think, icons from the tradition of Eastern Orthodoxy are very popular. And to many people, they epitomize the very essence of spirituality. People have gotten very interested in icons, and we now find them in our churches and in people's homes, and there are books and workshops and all sorts of ways in which we are encouraged to engage with icons as a way to deepen our spirituality. And Brown in no way wishes to disparage the very considerable merits, both artistic and religious, of iconography in this Eastern tradition. But he is concerned that the emphasis on icons tends to be on what he calls transcendence, that the world of the icon, there are certain conventions that icons must obey. Icons always have to be presented in the kind of flat Byzantine style, without what we might call a more realistic sense of perspective or human depiction. And icons also always have to present their figures in what is thought to be the historically accurate dress. Now, some of that is speculative, but the iconic tradition must present its figures, in this case Mary and the infant Jesus, in what were thought to be clothes that they might have actually worn. And so Brown's point is that the iconographic conventions place everything firmly in the past, and they emphasize God's distance from us in a good way. God is distant from us. God is transcendent. And one reason why people are drawn to icons is that they give us some sense of the transcendent, majestic nature of God. But what Brown wants to do is say that's wonderful, but it's limited, because there is another aspect to God's interaction with us, and that is not God's transcendence, but God's immanence. And that he finds in the Renaissance tradition, the more realistic tradition of Renaissance art, which does present the human figure in a more realistic way. That is, it looks more like actual people and not the flat Byzantine style. But also, one of the things that the Renaissance painters did is they deliberately made the figures contemporary to their own era. They anachronistically presented them in 16th century Italian garb, let's say, not what Mary may have worn 1,500, 1,600 years earlier. They presented Mary as if she were a contemporary person. And so just one interesting thing, if you notice, this icon is actually less old than this painting. This painting is from the 15th century. This icon is from the 16th century. But icons, no matter when they're written, and by the way, icons are written, not painted. Icons are always in this Byzantine style. There can be no development. And so Brown's point is that paintings like this, the Spinelli Mother and Child, or even more famously, Caravaggio's Calling of Matthew, in which, interestingly, if you look here on the right side, Jesus and whoever the man with him, whose face is away from us, perhaps Peter, are apparently in first century type garb, but clearly all the men on this side are in what would have been typical of Caravaggio's day. And so Caravaggio is here, doing something interesting with time, but clearly the men, including St. Matthew, who is a tax collector, who is here being called by Jesus away from his tax collecting, are clearly not remotely in what we might consider authentic first century garb. And Brown's point is that what the Renaissance seeks to do is to emphasize not divine transcendence so much, but divine immanence, God coming to us in our culture as one of us. So his point is that this is not better than icons, but it gives us a different sense of what it means for God to relate to us. So both are necessary, both transcendence and immanence. And he says, for God to have impact on every aspect of us, immanence must also be claimed. And by the way, I hope you know that's immanence with an I, as coming close, not immanence with an E, being exalted, just so that you know. For God to have impact on every aspect of us, immanence must also be claimed. God involved with matter. Christians believe that this happened, I'm quoting Brown here, Christians believe that this happened at the deepest and most profound level in the Incarnation. But if there is to be a continuing effect, this cannot have happened just once, but must relate to all material existence. It is this insight that the Renaissance takes up and defends in its art. So Brown wants to say that paintings like this we should think of, sacramental. We should think of them as outward and visible signs by which divine grace might be mediated to us. Now, the next chapter in this book, God and Enchantment of Place, deals with the natural world and depictions of it in landscape paintings. So, paintings like Caravaggio's, which show us a biblical scene, are clearly rooted in the biblical story. There is something narrative about them that links us to what God has done in history. But Brown takes us on a tour through the 19th century tradition of landscape art, in which paintings such as this by Caspar David Friedrich, or this by John Constable, or this by Thomas Cole, and I actually saw Thomas Cole this morning at the Museum of Art, but it was actually a European scene. So Thomas Cole was one of the founders of what's called the Hudson River School of American Art, but he actually painted some European scenes as well. So there was a big landscape of his, it wasn't a landscape, it was some European building, but by him at the museum. So Brown wants to say that these paintings are deliberately trying to show us God's natural world, but in a way that we are meant to be drawn to think of God as well as the world. So I don't know if you notice these two tiny little figures here. It looks like a man and a woman. And there could be something allegorical here. Maybe that's meant to be Adam and Eve. We don't know. But here are human figures dwarfed by the immensity of God's glorious creation. So his point here is that we shouldn't just look at art that is specifically religious in its inspiration, i.e. paintings of scenes from the Bible, but that even landscape art might be a way in which God's goodness and beauty can be mediated to us. But then he goes an even further step, and he looks at 20th century, or well, late 19th century art like Van Gogh and Cézanne, where things are starting to be less realistic in their representation and more impressionist. But then he takes us into abstract expressionism, and Kandinsky and Mondrian and Paul Klee. And he actually quotes from their essays and their letters and their manifestos, in which they say, we are trying to show that all reality has a spiritual aspect to it, that there is something. I mean, hear this remarkable thing by Kandinsky, that there is something other than just matter in this world. So, we don't normally think of such paintings as having a religious or theological character to them, but Brown thinks that they say something of the divine. And, we can talk about that. We'll have some time for Q&A. And, feel free to raise questions and push back and say, no, that's too much. You don't have to agree with me or with him. But I think what we may find we have more common ground with is architecture. And this is something that Brown is really interested in. And he's written a lot on architecture. And one of his claims is, and this is not unique to him by any means, but that each style of architecture is trying to say something. And he looks at the way in which this is St. Martin in the Fields, which is obviously an 18th century building, but it's in the neoclassical style. It is evoking the classical Greek era with these columns. And what he says is that the classical and the neoclassical architecture speaks of rationality. It speaks of reason as being somehow central to things. This is Durham Cathedral, where Brown was a canon for 17 years, and where, as I said, I began my studies with him. And Durham is in a style that's called Romanesque, but that in England they call it Norman, because the Normans brought it. But everywhere else in the world it's called Romanesque, and it's got this very weighty character to it. You feel not in an oppressive way. You don't feel oppressed, but you do feel the weight of the building pressing in on you in a way that's actually quite reassuring with these massive columns. And a thing that Durham Cathedral tour guides love telling people, and it's you find it very hard to believe, but these columns are actually as the distance around the column is the same as the height. The circumference, that they're so wide that their circumference is the same as the height of them, and they're given different carvings. And this doesn't look like an audience that's probably rushed out to see the Avengers Endgame movie, but there's a scene, this doubles as Asgard, the realm of the Norse gods. There's a scene set in Durham Cathedral, and if you've seen any of the Harry Potter movies, this is Hogwarts. So this Durham Cathedral doubles as a lot of exotic locales, physical and metaphysical. But what Brown says is this is his preferred architecture for the immanence of God, for God coming down to be with us. Whereas Gothic architecture lifts us up, and famously Gothic architecture strains towards heaven, and the airiness and the sense of light and height, and in some of these great Gothic buildings like York Minster, the walls are basically all glass, and that's why they have the flying buttresses, because without it, the thing would simply collapse. And so for Brown, the Gothic speaks of divine transcendence. Brown points out that we Anglicans don't really go for Baroque. He says the one style of architecture that Anglicans never really embraced is the Baroque style. We kind of left that to the Catholics, particularly in the Counter-Reformation. But the one great exception is St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And I don't have any pictures of that, but that is in the Baroque style. But Baroque, he says, speaks of divine exuberance and playfulness, which again is maybe something that we Anglicans need to take more seriously, that there is something about God that is not just serious and severe, but that there is a playfulness to God. But then we have the simplicity of modernism. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple, which is in the modernist style. And again, we don't have a lot of examples of this, but I mean, which chapel did you show me here? Bishop Moore is a modernist, very simple type of architecture. And so modernism, he says, speaks of divine simplicity. And then postmodernism is a term that we hear a lot of in contemporary philosophy and theology, but it actually is an architectural term. It began in architecture. The first use of the term postmodernist was coined by architects to describe the style that came after modernism. And postmodernism is an eclectic blending of all the different styles. So this is a postmodern Roman Catholic cathedral in which, I mean, it looks kind of unusual, which is the point, but all the different styles might be found within postmodernism, classical and Romanesque and Gothic and so forth. So what Brown wants to say is that each style says something different about God, and that we need to be attentive to that. What is the building saying? And there's a famous saying in religious architecture that the building always wins. That you have to know, if you're a priest serving a particular congregation, you have to know what style your church is in and what is the building saying. Because if you try to say something against the architecture, the building will always win. Now you can try to modify that, and one of Brown's points is that because of the hugely transcendent upward lift of Gothic architecture, which is very transcendent, Gothic art, by contrast, tends to be more immanent. And so there's a sense in which the art in a Gothic architecture tries to balance out or say something to complement, not contradict, but complement the style. And likewise, in your own buildings, he says you have to know what it says, not so that you must always agree with it, but that you can intelligently interact with it. But his main point is that all of these styles speak of God, and that we need to listen to what the building is saying, independently of what is going on in it. So what he wants to say is that buildings themselves can be sacramental, not just what happens in them. Now remember, this is all from that one book, God and Enchantment of Place. And the remainder of this book, he widens the perspective to take account not just of Christian, but of Hindu and Muslim examples. He has a whole chapter on gardens as symbolic representations of paradise or of the whole universe. And he concludes, as I mentioned earlier in that first essay, with the religious implications of athletics. And he points out that, of course, the Olympics began in ancient Greece as a religious festival, and that athletics was understood to be religious. And he looks at various films, contemporary films, that deal with sports. He has a whole section on golf, for those of you who might be interested. But I now want to turn more briefly to the second book, and then the third book we'll just touch on. So the second book is called God and Grace of Body, Sacrament and Ordinary. And This book has two main sections. The first is on bodies proper, but the second is on music, which is maybe a little bit odd because of the theme of body, but his point is that music is bodily, even though we hear it, and it seems in some ways ethereal or disembodied. There still is always an embodied character to music. Somebody's playing this. And so here, I mentioned earlier, he expands the classical definition of a sacrament, an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, to include the audible. He says sacraments can be heard as well. And in the section on music on this book, he has 3 chapters: classical music, pop music, and then a chapter on blues, musicals, and opera. And what he says in the introduction is that he's convinced that God may be found in every aspect of human experience, and therefore, as a deliberate challenge to the reader, I try to indicate how God might be experienced through musical forms as varied as opera and jazz, Schubert and Led Zeppelin. And given that popular music is almost completely disparaged or ignored by both church and academy, let me focus on that chapter. I think it's in some ways easier for us to engage with the classical musical tradition, but I think it's more interesting in some ways what Brown has to say about pop music. And he observes that popular music is often the only form of non-visual culture to penetrate the modern home. And by visual culture there, he really means television. And what he's saying is that in many homes, and he's making what might seem to be an elitist comment, but he's actually making it to make a anti-elitist point. What he's saying is in many homes, the only form of culture is television and pop music. And we should take that seriously and ask, how are these media actually shaping people? What are they saying? And he supports this with a statement from Bruce Springsteen, who grew up in a working class Roman Catholic family in New Jersey, and who went to a parochial school and had his hand smacked with a ruler by the nuns, and didn't like it very much, and eventually left the church, partly because of his negative experiences. And he says that, Springsteen says that rock music arrived with the transformative power of a revelation. This is Springsteen quoting. He said, "Rock and roll reached into all those homes where there was no music or books or anything. That's what happened in my house." And so Brown then considers multiple genres and dozens of ostensibly secular musicians and bands, ranging from pop to rock to heavy metal to grunge to rap to soul to hip hop. And as I mentioned, another chapter talks about blues and country, in addition to musicals, that is, theatrical musicals and opera. And what he appreciates about such popular music is the way it often raises spiritual issues implicitly or indirectly. But in his view, in so doing, in doing it indirectly, you may know the famous line from Emily Dickinson. She says, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant. Don't tell it directly." And what he says is that pop music often takes that insight of Emily Dickinson and tells things in a way that's more effective than, say, a hymn or music by contemporary Christian musicians, where it's so overt. And his treatment of Springsteen is a case in point, tracing the story of his, as I said earlier, negative experiences in a Catholic parochial school as a child, to his eventual return to some form of faith. And Springsteen's return to faith is exemplified powerfully in his 2002 album, The Rising, dealing with the aftermath of 9/11 by exploring themes of self-sacrifice, resurrection, and even ascension. And the album is called The Rising, and one of the songs is called The Rising, the title song. And Brown says that the cover song's catchy chorus, "Come on up for the rising," is thus about much more than merely transcending human difficulties. Implicitly, it can also be seen to be about Christ's own resurrection and the possibilities for new life that this offers to us. So if you look on your handout, we have the lyrics of the song. And again, this is a song that was published the year after 9/11. It's not one of the songs that's explicitly about 9/11. Some of the most powerful songs on this album are. As you may know, Springsteen often writes songs from a different character. He tells stories. And in some of the songs on this album, he sings from the point of view of a spouse or loved one who lost someone in the towers. In one very powerful song, he writes from the perspective of someone who died and is looking back at their life, at the life that they left behind. This is not one of those songs, but what he did say in one interview is that this first verse, can't see nothing in front of me, can't see nothing coming up behind, make my way through this darkness, I can't feel nothing but the chain that binds me, lost track of how far I've gone, how far I've gone, how high I've climbed, on my back's a 60-pound stone, on my shoulder a half-mile of line. He says that this verse is from the point of view of a soldier in Afghanistan or Iraq. The 60-pound stone is their backpack, and the line is the line of soldiers as they're marching through the desert, and they're all tied together. But then the next verse, after the chorus, "Coming up for the rising," talks about someone wearing the cross of my calling. Now, who is that? Might that be a priest? It's unclear. So I'm going to play the song, or actually Adam's going to play the song for us. Bear in mind, this is a rock song, so there's, drums and guitars, and, it's a bit rousing. But as you listen to it, listen to the words and reflect on them and see how they work on you. So we'll play this song. Can't see nothing in front of me. In one of the, sorry, all the volume went up. In one of the quotations that Brown cites from Springsteen, in this chapter, Springsteen says that this song was meant to be, and these are his words, a secular Stations of the Cross. And so Brown's point is that for people who may never go to church, who still hear this song on the radio as they're driving through the rush hour of Dallas, what are they hearing? What are they experiencing? What might God be saying to them through this song? And how might it be maybe the only sacramental encounter they might have that day or that week? And Springsteen is clearly intending this song to have some religious significance, but it's very vague. He talks about Mary, he talks about the Lord, he talks about the cross, but there's no specificity here. There's nothing that makes this a clearly Christian song, but in the same way that it is vague, it might actually, Brown says, be more effective for some people. So his point is just that we shouldn't dismiss without thinking the way in which pop culture, in its pervasiveness and in its very ambiguity, might actually be conveying God's grace to people. In the last book in this series, remember there's 3 books, it's called God in Mystery and Words, Experience Through Metaphor and Drama. And here he looks more specifically at poetry, at hymnody, and in theatrical plays. I mentioned that in the previous book he has a chapter on musicals, but here this is more drama performance without that musical component. And what he says is that words themselves can be sacramental, that the tradition has often said word and sacrament, as if these are separate things. We often say this is the liturgy of the word, and now we're moving on to the sacrament. And Brown says, no, words themselves can be sacramental. And he looks at metaphor, and drawing in particular on T.S. Eliot, he says that metaphor brings things together. Metaphor makes connections. And in making those connections, it often has a healing, integrating character to it. But also just beauty, that beauty itself can move us closer to God. And he cites the Roman Catholic poet Les Murray. And when I prepared these notes, I said the contemporary Roman Catholic poet Les Murray, but he died on Monday at the age of 80, which is, people are still writing obituaries about him. But Les Murray is a Australian poet, and in this remarkable poem of his called God and Religion, he says, God is the poetry caught in any religion, caught, not imprisoned. So that we might in some ways find God in poetry, but God is never then fully captured or constrained within the words. God always exceeds our grasp. And in addition to poems and sermons and hymn lyrics, as I said, Brown also considers drama as a place of sacramental encounter. And he means secular drama there. He means like plays that we might actually go to see. But he then says, but of course, liturgy has a dramatic character to it. And he looks at the way in which we should be more attentive in our liturgies to, without becoming artificial, that liturgy does have costuming and staging and choreography, and that we often could do a better job with all those things, and that we shouldn't be afraid to embrace without becoming artificial, the truly theatrical character of our liturgy. Now, I don't have another slide, but these are all big books of like 400 pages each. But I've recently, and I don't think it's in the back there, but I've recently co-edited a collection of Brown's essays. So that the title, well, you've got it on your handout there. The title of this presentation is A Generous God. And the essay collection that I've co-edited of his work is called Divine Generosity and Human Creativity, Theology Through Symbol, Painting, and Architecture. So some of these themes he's also explored in some essays, and that's found in that book as well. So we have plenty of time for Q&A, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions. We have one more song that we'll close with, this song that's called Grace, but I think we'll pause here, and if people want to ask any questions, please do. I can't remember. He covers a lot of ground, but that's specifically from one of his essays. It's in one of Eliot's essays in which he makes this claim about the way poetry integrates things. Whoops. Not that one. So Eliot has this famous phrase, the disassociation of sensibility, the dissociated sensibility. And what Eliot says is that that's what happens basically when right brain and left brain get too far apart. He didn't quite use those terms because that wasn't a thing back then, but that there's feeling, there's intellect and there's emotion, and the integrated sensibility brings them together, and the disassociated sensibility separates them. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about Brown's views on dance and how that associated dance was maybe the best example?
Yes. Oops, sorry, I'm doing the wrong thing here. Oops. Yeah, sorry. Oh, okay. Actually, maybe you need to do it. No, wait a second, I'm on. He took over. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so One of Brown's colleagues is named Anne Loades, Loades. And Anne Loades was also with Brown, a professor at Durham University. But she is herself also a former ballet dancer and still, at the age of 85, has still been teaching dance. And so she was one of the main inspirations for him in regard to dance. So there is a chapter in this book called The Dancer's Leap, in which he looks at dance. And one of his interesting claims, it's fascinating, he says, of all religions in the world, Christianity should be the most sympathetic to dance, because Christianity is about a God who becomes incarnate in a body. But actually, he says, and he goes through all the world religions, and that we're one of the most resistant religions to dance. So he says there's this very odd thing that Christians have this suspicion and fear of dance when we should actually embrace it. So what he looks at are the way in which various 20th century choreographers have tried to overcome this Christian fear of dance in various ways. And his main concern, as the title suggests, is the dancer's leap, is that somehow there's something transcendent, that when the dancer leaves the earth, there's a moment in which they're poised between heaven and earth, and somehow speaks of that upward lift to God, but of also God coming down to us. So it's a really interesting chapter. Another book that's not up here, I actually edited not just a collection of Brown's essays, but a book of essays engaging with him. And a woman named Kimmerer Lamoth wrote the chapter responding to his chapter on dance, in which she said, this is really helpful, but it doesn't go far enough. And she herself is also a dancer, so she tries to push him even more. But if you're interested in that, it's in this book. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes, that's really interesting. And so as it happens, the book on C.S. Lewis that I edited, this is all turning into a big commercial for my books. There's an interesting pun there that some people have actually taken a little bit too far. The word that was used in the 3rd and 4th centuries to describe the Trinity's, the relation, is perichoresis. Which means intermingling or interpenetration. It's close to, but not identical to, the word from which we get choreography. So some people have seen the word perichoresis as itself referring to the dance of the Trinity. And in the book on C.S. Lewis that I edited, there's a chapter on Lewis's theology in which the author, Paul Fittis, says it was actually Lewis who first suggested that the Trinity itself should be understood as a dance. That the more traditional view was that everything, the great dance, was creation around the Trinity. That the Trinity was, as it were, the unmoved point around which all moved. And Paul Fittis says it's now very popular for theologians to talk about the Trinity itself as a dance. But kind of working backwards, he says, I can't find anybody who said this sooner than C.S. Lewis. In his book Mere Christianity. So yes, it's a very interesting way in which we're now thinking of God, but it's actually a fairly new one. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
What was the name of that Episcopal Cathedral?
Oh, St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In London, yes.
Second
Yeah.
question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you went to visit our sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
And what did our building say to you?
Well, I just saw it very briefly, and I'm trying to place it architecturally. I mean, we were discussing about this. It's very unusual. It's very much in the post-Vatican II style. I think it's probably modernist in its primary inspiration. I don't know if it's early enough. When was it built? 56? So I think it's too early to be postmodern, but to me it's somewhere between modern and postmodern. It's a fascinating space, and I'd like to spend more time in it. And I mean, the stained glass and the sculpture, the shape of it. But to me, there's something eclectic about it, which seems kind of proto-postmodern in a very interesting way. So,
But the rare is that something is both modern and traditional. It's a fascinating
yes.
phenomenon.
Yes, I mean, I think it's unique. And of course, you know you should never use the word unique to mean unusual, right? You can never say very unique. Something is either unique or it's not unique. So it's unique. So yes. And of course, I mean, it's also important to say that you really can't know a space fully until you've spent time in it and worshiped in it and so forth. So I've spent about 5 minutes in that space, but it's fascinating. And then Eric showed me the other chapels as well. And so what's the little Gothic one?
St. Michael.
St. Michael. That's very much in the simple kind of rustic Gothic style. And then Bishop Moore is more modernist in a more conventional way. But the main church is unique.
Robert, I wonder if you want to say a little bit about Notre Dame and the impact
Oh.
that you have with the architecture there, even those who aren't necessarily people of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, that was just something where the whole world, mourned as a building burned. Like, well, why? It's just a building, right? But it's not. I mean, it's not just a building. And it's not just a building partly for historical reasons. And, it represents European Christianity, and it represents France. It represents, for those who are Roman Catholic, Our Lady. That's what the name Notre Dame means. By the way, just a little, sorry, no, well, I just have to say this. I lived in the UK for a while, and I once mentioned the University of Notre Dame to a British friend who just reared back and said, Notre Dame? You don't call it that, do you? And I said, well, what do you call the capital of France? And he said, Paris. And I said, no, you don't. You call it Paris. So everybody mangles the words in some ways, but Notre Dame means Our Lady, right? I mean, so it's like this is a building of immense. I don't want to say sentimentality because it's deeper than that. It's the, well, yeah, exactly. I mean, there is a Thank you. See, this is good. Yeah, good student. Yeah, taught well. Yeah, I mean, and so I think people felt something visceral was being taken away from them, especially when we thought the whole thing was going to go up, right? I mean, it really looked like the whole thing was going to be gone. So I think that it was people were feeling a deep sense of loss because something in that building spoke to them of God's presence with them. Yeah. So thank you. Yes, it's sacramental.
But it's very interesting thing is some of the first pictures after the five show the cross.
Yes.
Very fun.
Right.
Sacrament,
Right. Which, as you recall, was also part of the aftermath of 9/11, was that there were the girders. I mean, it wasn't an intentional cross, but in one of the wreckages, there was a cross girder.
I was going to say it's interesting too how the building in Notre Dame was basically a huge
Mm.
like armory for a lot of cities. Now it has
Yes, I mean, it's gone through various stages. I'm sorry, I'm putting this down because it was so high up so I could read. It's gone through various phases, and yeah, right. I mean, you may know that in France, after the revolution, I mean, the state owns the buildings. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church doesn't own most of its own churches. So it's actually Notre Dame belongs to the country of France. Even though the church is allowed to continue to use those buildings, they don't belong to them. So, yes, you've been raising your hand.
Two words that David Brown wrote on the first page here jumped out at me. My BA degree is in urban analysis, and I
Oh.
want to write a major paper at one time on town planning.
Mhm.
What do you have advice on town?
Sure. Well, he has a whole chapter on town planning, looking mostly at older cities. So he looks at, for instance, ancient Rome, and he looks at Paris, and he looks at the way in which certain cities were designed around certain buildings that the cities themselves had spiritual, theological, religious significance. And that, you were, as you approached the center, you went through various gates, or you went through various walls, or various stages, all leading up to this great thing. So he talks about the way in which, for instance, in Edinburgh, there was more of an egalitarian character because the different classes lived in the same building, even if they lived at different floors. The tenement system of Edinburgh created more interaction between the social classes. That this is in the book. This book. This is all in this book, God and Enchantment of Place. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like in London today, there are big debates. Can we put a skyscraper next to St. Paul's Cathedral? No, we can't. We can't let this building be overwhelmed. So all the skyscrapers are out at a further area. So even now, there's a sense in which the Cathedral of St. Paul's in the contemporary city of London must have some integrity and not be dwarfed and diminished by some modern skyscraper. So basically he's looking at the way in which towns used to speak of the divine in a very intentional way, and that contemporary town planning is much more focused on efficiency and traffic, and that's really been lost.
It'd be an interesting study to go through small old towns in Texas and look at how they're constructed. All the small towns you go to, there's a square,
Mm-hmm.
there's a courthouse, church,
Right.
and
Right.
and it would be a similar kind of.
Yeah, so Brown would say, so there you have civic authority, you have common space, and you have the divine, like in the center of the town. And like every town speaks of that. And whether you consciously bring that, to articulation or not, everybody that lives there knows that these are the three aspects of their existence. And, that's very important, and that's very intentional. Like the soul of the town. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I just wanted to make an observation. These lovely churches that you've shown are mostly tourist attractions.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go and see the worship services there, you see the congregation,
Mm-hmm.
there's not a great deal of fire in those churches. Now, let's bring it over to us. Do you see maybe in the next 50 years that we're moving away from these big churches into something that is smaller and more communal and more active?
Well, I'm a professor of theology. Right. I'm a professor of theology, not a prophet. So that's a wonderful question. And I don't mean to be facetious and dismissive. I simply have no idea. I mean, people often say, well, we're moving away from religious faith in this country, but I believe in cycles. I don't mean like in some kind of, determined sense, but I just mean I think that we see an ebb and flow in society, and we go through various phases. And so I don't believe that we can just say, well, this is where the chart's going, and so it's going to keep going in that direction. What the next 10, 15, 20 years are going to bring is anyone's guess. But I'm not ready to say that we're moving towards extinction the way some people think. But that's about all I can say. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
So, consequently, the city,
Mm-hmm. Right. 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 Mm-hmm. 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 Mhm. Right. Sure, sure. Sure. Yes, absolutely, yes. And I mean, just more broadly, I mean, so back to Eric's example of the town square, I mean, it used to be that when new developments, when new towns were developed or new neighborhoods were developed, there'd always be a spot for a church. They would just, whoever was planning that next suburb would say, well, within a certain distance of the houses, there needs to be a church. Well, at some point that stopped happening. And so then you had what's sometimes called the suburban captivity of the church, in which people have to get in a car and drive 5 or 10 miles to get to church because there is no local church in that whole area. So, oh, yes, right. Right. Parishes were geographical boundaries like school districts, yes. And that's still the case in England. I mean, there still are those parish boundaries. Others, we've got about 15 minutes, so yes, ma'am. Oh. Oh, yes, that's very much Brown's view, at least. That's very much Brown's view. That sometimes, I mean, Brown is very worried, again, he's very worried about theologians, even though he is one, and even though I'm one. He's worried about theologians because he thinks that theologians think they know the truth and that their job is to, as it were, tell people what to think. And he thinks that artists sometimes fall into that category as well. So he most appreciates artists who are less dogmatic than that. And so yes, he very much thinks that sometimes atheist or agnostic artists might convey some truth that a religious artist doesn't. Or that their art may be sacramental, even if that wasn't the intention. So one of his most extreme examples, and I can't remember the title of it, but the English painter Francis Bacon, who was known for his horrendous images of heads and screaming popes and stuff, painted a triptych on the death of his lover George Dyer, who actually committed suicide. And it's this horrific image, these 3 images of this this death. But very incongruous, very oddly, there's this light bulb hanging in the midst of all this darkness. And Brown says, well, what's that light bulb doing there? Why is there light in the midst of this darkness? And as maybe against his will, as Francis Bacon may be saying, there is some light and truth and goodness that transcends all this, even though I can't imagine what it is. So Brown's like, this is a really powerful piece of religious art, even if that's not what Francis Bacon intended it to be. So that's at least how he would answer your question.
I want to piggyback just real quick. I'll do a plug. This summer, we're going to do a 10-week series in the chapter in St. Michael's Chapel at 10 o'clock, starting June 2nd, mostly by our clergy, in which we're going to explore this exact sort of thing, faith in literature, film, and music. So every week we'll have a different presentation by different clergy that is going to attempt to, not exactly the same, but we're going to try to show you all how we have had really interesting faith questions asked, or how our faith has been strengthened through different art. We're going to watch the movie. Yeah.
Great. Maybe one more question in the song? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Word and sacrament, yes, very much so. That's a great question. That's more of a question for our liturgy professor at Sewanee, Jim Terrell, because I'm not up on the history of that. But I mean, certainly at the Reformation, that became very clear. And even in Anglicanism, that distinction between word and sacrament became very clear. But whether it has roots in the earlier medieval era, I'm not sure. And you know, people often say that Christianity is a religion of the word, a religion of the book. And Brown says, well, yes, it is, but there's so much of this material aspect to it, and we focus on an incarnate God. So it's incomplete to say we're just a religion of the book or a religion of the word, and that words themselves are sacramental, he said. So, but as you said, yes, I mean, so in the Gospel of John, it begins by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But then there are these great I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the water, the living water. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you know, you have no life. I mean, so the Word itself says, I am sacramental in the Gospel of John. That's a great observation. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I just want to maybe just astray, but to what extent is our concern about Notre Dame and just indicative of our sense, our search for permanence, eternal, and something that we can look at as an alternative to our own lives in which there is so much transient.
Yeah. So I was once in this building, and the dean of Durham, he now retired, Michael Sadgrove, was leading a tour of students, and so I was on it. And this is the dean of the cathedral, and he was walking us through this building, and we got to this point right here, and he said, "But it won't last forever." And we were just like, "Really?" Yes, really. It won't last forever. And he just said it in such a matter-of-fact way. And it's like, I mean, so, yes. I mean, I think that the whole thing, I mean, it's a wonderful question, because on one hand, we want to emphasize the materiality and the embodiedness of our faith and not just see it as this purely spiritual, ethereal thing. But at the same time, everything in this world is mortal and transient. And some things, like this building is 1,000 years old. But it's not going to last forever, no matter what, you know, we do. And
No matter what we would want.
right, exactly. And what's interesting, so the best example of the difference between the English Reformation and the Scottish Reformation is that when you go north of the border, there aren't any cathedrals because the Scots tore them all down. So there's St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, but that's not really a cathedral. It was called a cathedral because it was like a cathedral. It was going to be a cathedral, but it never was. But there's a huge ruined cathedral in St. Andrews. So I went literally from this building, and the college that I studied, so Durham's a collegiate university, and my college was literally just on the other side of the rose window here. It's called St. Chad's College. And then I went to St. Andrews, where I lived in a house that overlooked the ruined cathedral. So the English kept their cathedrals because they kept their bishops. The Scots got rid of the bishops and the cathedrals. So in Scotland, the cathedrals that were there, I think the only one that survived was Glasgow, because they turned it into 3 different Presbyterian churches, all met in the same building. But, you know, there you see ancient ruins with open to the sky, and ultimately that is what will happen. But, you know, this is where the promise of resurrection, I think, comes in for us. What will happen to our buildings, I don't know.
A wonderful image that I might leave you with.
Yeah.
We were in Reading, England, studied there, and we entered into a church area which has had its roof removed, its red roof removed at the time of Henry VIII or whatever. And inside, it happened to be autumn, there was lovely green grass covered with beautiful golden leaves of the autumn. And so maybe something arises even out of the ruins.
Sure. Well, a great example is Coventry, which was bombed during the Second World War. And so they built a new cathedral next to the ruins of, I mean, they didn't just leave the ruin as it were, but they took away what they could. But there is the bombed cathedral next to the new cathedral. And I think that speaks of both destruction and restoration.
Just a little advice.
Uh-huh.
You need to stay over the weekend and get Eric to take you to see the painted churches in the hill country.
Oh,
That would knock you out.
maybe next time. Yeah, so the last song, so this is, I mean, many of you may know about the band U2. They're a very popular Irish band. This is one of their songs, and Brown actually talks about this song. It's called Grace. And he says this is like really good theology. But what I'm going to play to you is not U2's version, but somebody else's version of their song. And what's interesting is that here in the song, in the original version, they speak of grace in feminine terms. And yet the singer of U2 is a man. So what I think is lovely is that this is a woman, Nicole Nordeman, singing U2's song Grace. So we get to hear it sung with a woman's voice. And again, I just wanted to leave us with this because, again, at the very beginning, if sacraments are outward and visible and audible signs of grace, well, then what is grace? So we'll hear it.